Okay, good.
Okay, shall I start?
Yes.
Okay, there was a lot of mention made earlier about the land use management processes, and it was one of my four takeaways of the SAPER project. I think there are a lot of others, but for me, these were the ones that stood out. It's the need for mentorship, the issues with registration process, which is linked to mentorship and the status of the planning profession. And some of this is coming out in Mishka's thesis that, God willing, will be submitted in the next 2 months. We're almost there. And then the other one was the inadequacy of our land use management systems. So we all know about our colonial and apartheid planning and the separation of white and other populations. The high quality building infrastructure was reserved for white neighborhoods, and little provision for others, which eventually developed on the periphery where the land was cheaper. The colonial and planning health regulations were there to protect the standards in white areas, separation of races, and apartheid just made it worse. The separation. It was a spatial, social, and economic separation. And I think Phil has explained some of the issues very well. Okay, next one. So post 1994, in fact, the change to planning legislation started a little bit earlier, but from 1994, we had major legal changes in South Africa. By 1996, we'd introduced spatial development frameworks instead of master plans. We've introduced integrated development plans, basically 5-year plans for a municipality that were supposed to be integrating all the departments, all the sector plans from national and provincial government, which has not happened. The legislation required community participation in planning, particularly at local level, and there are various formats for that, such as ward committees and so forth. We had our National Development Plan approved in 2009. We had the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act in 2013 with its spatial planning principles of spatial justice, spatial sustainability, spatial resilience, good governance, and efficiency. We also have an integrated urban development framework of 2016, and the picture on the screen is of the draft National Spatial Development Framework that we anticipate will be approved by Cabinet by February. So we've made a lot of change in terms of our legislation. However, we still have lots of challenges, as Phil alluded to. At the moment, the unemployment rate is at least 30% and possibly more. We've had our economies been downgraded substantially over the last year. Poverty is rife. COVID pointed out the food insecurity of poor households and especially the informal economy, which is very dependent on immediate income and so that they can purchase things, and the lockdown made that almost impossible, and so it was a huge problem with food insecurity then. We have very weak economic growth and job creation. Only 13%, if that, of the population are taxpayers. For instance, in the UK, where the number is nearly 3 times that. The structure of our cities has not changed much in 25 years. If anything, it's actually got more unequal. And zoning is still the dominant form of land use management. And the SAPER project pointed out just how inadequate this is. And our processes do not accommodate the poor or people in traditional areas. So while the legislation has been very progressive, the situation on the ground hasn't changed much. The SAPER findings indicated that the land use management system allows for creativity and transformation. It requires that. But land use zoning, as applied, and our processes do not accommodate livelihoods, informality, or diverse cultural needs. The emphasis on uniformity ignores different economic, cultural, and religious traditions. Last year I was in Rustenburg, and a planner there said, we treat everybody equally. Therefore, a developer in a poor neighborhood will provide as much parking as someone in a rich neighborhood, even though the guy said, but my clients don't use cars, they use taxis. But we've got to be uniform. And this is the ridiculousness of the system that we have at the moment. And so we require a different model. And so we have to change how we do land use management. We need approaches that work for diverse settings, cultures, and needs. And there are emerging ideas that can assist us with this, but we still need to work on it to turn these ideas into a clear framework of decolonized land use practice. And that is largely a part of Stuart's thesis and of a book that we have a book contract and we're working on it. We have to produce it next year, and we probably would be able to include it as a SAPER project or product, because a lot of it comes out of the SAPER project. And I think that's my say. Thanks.
Thank you, Brenna. Stuart, do you want to take over and just see how you want to run the discussion?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to present now. I'm going to keep my time down so that I can just give space for Sona and Martin to come in. And then I think we just open up discussion from there. Lauren?
That's fine. I just can't see you. I don't know if you may yeah.
Sorry,
no.
can you see me now? Brilliant. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'm just going to present now, and then I will make space for Sona and Martin after that. Okay. Okay, just checking. Can everyone see the screen? Lauren, just checking. Can you see the screen?
We can all see it. All good.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, yeah, so as Lauren indicated, this is just going to focus on a little bit more on the South African side, and especially what we found in terms of successes, and I think I put too many C's or S's in that word, of planning, education, and practice in South Africa. So very briefly, I'm going to just quickly go over some of our end of project events, and then kind of go a little bit more into the academic work that's published and in process. And hopefully you'll see quite a strong connection between what came out at the events and the academic work that we've done with it. Okay, so starting with events, we had kind of two workshops, one at the end of 2018, one at the end of 2019. In both cases, it was about bringing together the SAPER team with a lot of practicing planners from public sector, private sector, as well as other academics as well. But there was a strong focus on kind of engaging with industry as well. Okay, so I'm going to roughly skip over the 2018 workshop, but just to emphasize, there was a workshop. We focused on candidacy and mentorship, had presentations, had discussion. But probably the more interesting of our events was kind of the 2019, I've called it the unconference. And a lot of the kind of, the credit for this event really goes to Sona. I was probably setting out with a very traditional event in mind, and Sona kind of really gave us a push to go towards a much better direction, which came out. So the aim of this event was to engage with planners, but the kind of the core idea of an unconference is that it's participant-driven, not presenter-driven. So we had a series of activities that allowed for us to basically let participants engage with the data and kind of almost direct to some extent how the day actually went. The focus of it was what I wish I knew, so kind of really lessons for practice, initially with a focus kind of on younger planners and kind of extended to be a bit wider, saying, when I started practice, what did I wish I knew? And very much the video that Lauren showed at the beginning of this event, sorry, the beginning of this, this call, it was kind of almost responding to quite a few of the lessons that we picked up out of this particular project. So We had 3 main sessions. I'm going to focus on the first and the last one, which were probably the more interesting ones with it. Okay, so what we did in this particular session was a dialogue walk. And just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the full process, but basically we started off with a process using an icebreaker where we paired participants at the workshop and we made sure that they had to go find someone that they didn't know. And then in the room, we basically put up about, I actually lost track, I think it was well over 50 quotes from our interviews and also from the African Center for Cities Planning Integrity Project. There was about 10 quotes up from them. So the focus was basically you would have a room and then you would have these kind of giant boards with quotes from all of the interviews that we did. 2 people would walk around, look at the different quotes, kind of discuss what really stood out for them. And then afterwards, they would then come back and basically choose one quote that really resonated with them and another quote that kind of made them feel uncomfortable. So from a research side, from a participant side, what this allowed for us is not to say, here is our research, this is what we see as important. It allowed for them to go through the quotes and say, this is, as participants, as what we see as important. So the example on this slide was the quote that had the most responses. And the quote that we had up was, the formal education was a foundation only, on-the-job training and experiences where the real education happens. And these were, I'm not going to read them, but the responses that we had to that quote were the ones kind of indicated with the green bullet points as well. So, for participants, it allowed for them to say, this is what is important to us, and this is our response to it. From a research side, what it also allowed for us to do is, and there's a broader kind of research methods kind of project that can kind of come out of this, is if you look at a traditional research process, you go off, you interview participants, and after that process, it's pretty much up to the researcher. You've got the transcript, you choose which quotes, you choose which theories, you choose how it gets all put together. From a research side, this also allowed for us to say we had interviewed practicing planners. Now, other practicing planners were responding to those quotes and saying, of that interview data, this is what we see as important. And kind of just highlight in the bold the kind of the 5 with the most amount of responses. And I think just in particular with the video that we did, really responded to this aspect of learning on the job. Noting we had 6 quotes out about this and about 20 responses to it. So this was really seen as something by participants as quite big. And you'll see coming these themes in the next couple of slides, politics and organization, gender, race, integrity, and informality as kind of really big themes that planners were engaging with in terms of just the number of responses. I'm just going to see if this is going to work in terms of playing. We then did a more traditional session after lunch where we broke off into groups and we kind of had someone do a prepared input and then there was discussion. After lunch, we had this session where we basically said to planners, drawing on the data generated throughout the course of the day, your own lived experience, use material on the table to create a prototype model of a planner's thrival guide. So what this was, and I'll show you in the actual video, was literally using things like little pieces of elastic and so forth to actually come up with a physical model, which some people had to use to kind of interpret the event. So I'm just going to quickly play this. This was done on the cell phone, just running around the room. So it's not high quality, but hopefully gives you an idea about what this kind of was about.
Stuart, there's no sound.
Oh, sorry, there's no sound. Okay. Okay, cool. Well, maybe the video is not going to work then. But basically, if you just see what it's kind of paused on, this was kind of like a physical model that was actually made, trying to kind of capture some of the lessons of today. I'm going to move on to the next couple of slides. Osona, I'm just going to highlight, if you want to pick up on any of this in your presentation, please feel free to do so in terms of this. Okay. So kind of this is where we kind of got to with the events, with an idea to basically share the information that we generated, but also to kind of involve practicing planners as a way to say, what do you see as important in our events? So almost there's a bit of a kind of back and forth in terms of we go off and gather data, we present, we gather data through presenting in order to try to bring ideas a bit in line with what was in industry. Okay, so kind of in the academic outputs, you'll see a lot of the themes that were kind of in those events came through in terms of these. We started off with, and kind of our first published output from this one was the survey. So we did the survey with 219 planners around South Africa, which is roughly about 5% of all registered and candidate planners in the country. So it had a good sample in terms of the information. And in the survey, and starting off with very much this question of planning education, we had a series of general questions, but we weren't particularly looking for a theme in terms of the responses. And in going through what both the quantitative and qualitative questions, we really picked up on kind of participants arguing around this age-old debate of theory versus practice. And that's kind of what shaped this paper, was basically what we actually found in terms of how people were responding. Without laboring the point, I mean, and just to start the slide, it's very easy to get kind of caught up in the negative. One of the big things of this paper is we asked the question, has your planning education prepared you for practice? And we had nearly 3/4 of respondents saying yes. Okay. So there was a hell of a lot of caveats to that answer and things they wanted fixed and corrected. But it's important to kind of start off with the acknowledgement that most respondents actually said, no, our planning education was valuable for when we needed to work. So this is kind of talking about the issues that they picked up on, but it must be seen as with that background of the more positive side. Really what we kind of found with the responses is there's almost 3 schools of thought with theory. We had on the one side that the 1/4 of respondents who were very negative about planning, very negative about their planning education. And for them, they kind of looked at theory and said, we learned all this theory and then we went off and worked and I never used it again, etc. So we had that one kind of school of thought with it. Then on the other end of the continuum, we had the smaller school of participants who were very, very pro-theory and had seen the value and so forth. But it was that middle response, which we're in the middle of the road, which was kind of the really interesting ones, which was people saying, we went up and learned the theory and we liked it, but we have no idea how to actually apply it in practice. And this is very much where this kind of paper got to, was this challenging of saying, what does this actually mean? Okay, so, and I think what we also found was when we spoke to the academics, there was a very defensive saying theory is important. We spoke to the practitioners and we had this kind of challenge of saying practice is important. Two of the key things was this question of, we say theory versus practice, but what do we actually mean by practice? And what we found is that when planners talked about practice, they were talking about 2 things. One, technical skills, things like GIS, CAD, so forth, etc. Learning how to do that technical thing of making a plan. And that was certainly part of the response. But for most of the respondents, when they were talking about practical, they also meant land use management, or in UK terms, development control. And there was this perception that land use management is a practical thing that we are not taught at universities. And this was problematic from kind of 2 respects. One, and this is a general issue, is that and we found that the majority of participants had at some point in their career done land use management, but universities weren't training them to do this kind of development control work. But there was a flip side to this, which was equally problematic, in that most participants saw land use management and development control as non-theoretical. So there was this complete disconnect between the ideas and theories that they were learning and how that actually affects development control work. And as someone who searches land use, we found this as highly problematic, because you'll find that in South Africa, practice hasn't really transformed, even with new planning legislation. And part of the problem is exactly this, that there is this not seeing how does these theories come into planning work. So just, just bearing in mind of time, really what we got to with this paper was arguing for basically applied theory. It's overcoming the practice and theory divide. And what I've just given here is like 2 examples. So if you look at a traditional planning program, you have a planning theory course. And in the planning theory course, you might have something like identify how the theories of environmental and social justice, etc., etc. And then in that same planning program, you'll have a practical component where you have to do, for example, compile a land use application or do a development, site development plan. So a lot of those silos that we argue about existing within government exist within planning academia, and we actually kind of reinforce. So, and almost in the year that this was written about more than a year ago, and I've kind of almost been trying to kind of play around with this idea about saying, how in one course do we bring together practical and applied theory? So kind of the example here would be saying, taking a bunch of planning regulations for a particular municipality, going through those planning regulations and saying, how does theory help us understand, you know, what these regulations do well, what they do poorly? And one of my own learnings through kind of trying to take what I'd written about in this paper and actually do it with my planning students was how easy it is for planning students to say the right things, but not believe them. And very much when I was trying to get the students to look at the planning regulations, a lot of the very out-of-date and very warring modernist views were very entrenched into their minds. And quite frankly, my initial experiment of trying to get students to apply theory to regulations, I failed dismally to actually get them to think beyond these very modernist views. So it's forced me to think a lot more about teaching pedagogy and how I'm going to have to try to deal with that. But there's also a reverse side of this, which is kind of the winnowing of theory. It's starting to say is theory can be useful, but not all theories are useful. So, you know, when we try to apply them to a situation, if we fail to be able to apply it, is it actually a good theory? And it's kind of, that's the reverse of that. I'm just mindful of time, so I'm just going to quickly run through this last one. Where we're moving to in terms of now is looking more at the issues of planning practice in South Africa. And this is kind of draft work that's either ready for publication or needs work. Still trying to figure that out. And when we talk to planners in South Africa, one of the questions we're asked is kind of, what do you view as the successes of planning in South Africa post-apartheid? What do you view as the failures of planning? Planners had very little consensus about what were the successes. The one aspect was passing of the new planning legislation. Other than that, when there's successes, there really wasn't consensus. However, with failures, there was a lot of consensus that there had been widespread failure to reform planning, and also consensus in the reasons. And the reasons we got were some of the usual laundry list: lack of capacity, failure to achieve job reservation, political interference, weak planning tools, and a smaller group of respondents were actually willing to admit planners' lack of key skills. And since we did these kind of interviews in South Africa, there's been a petition, and I'm going to say a very poorly put together petition, the one that managed to get about 2,000 responses arguing for the protection of planning in South Africa. So in this paper, we've kind of recognized these arguments, but I think there's been kind of two issues coming up. The first issue is there's a very South African response to start saying is because we're a poor country, we don't have the capacity to do X, Y, Z. This, however, was 2 days ago was an article on RTBI's website where a similar study was looking in the UK at you know, the housing design quality conundrum and talking to planners in the UK. And I just want to take a quote from this report, and you'll notice that the points highlighted in bold are quite similar to the points found in South Africa. So issues that we are seeing as primarily South African are actually not, that there's actually a broader issue, at least in the Anglo-speaking world, of these kind of feelings of not having power, of, you know, being overlooked, you know, scarcity of key skills and so forth, etc. And so I think that this is almost a challenge with this work, is starting to say, is, you know, if these issues are not just South African, how do we make this kind of bridge with it? I'm going to end on these last two slides. What we try to do with this paper is not just simply kind of document the views of planners. We actually kind of put a bit of a challenge to these views. And the next slide is almost a bit of a critique of these views already. So the problem with the kind of the views of planners saying, you know, there's too much political interference, there's not enough capacity, and so forth. You know, we need job reservation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that these goals that planners are arguing for are unlikely to be achieved to a satisfactory extent. So capacity is a nice, easy one, because, you know, planners keep on saying we need to employ more planners to do planning work. South Africa is in the budget crisis, and we've got a massive public sector bill. The chances of us actually hiring more planners is extremely minimal. Similarly with issues like political interference, it's highly unlikely that that's actually going to change. So the problem is that we're kind of focusing our energy on a series of issues, and in a particular way that's likely to result in more disillusionment and frustration. So it's kind of, we almost need to find a way to reframe the debate, recognizing these issues, but saying, right, how do we reframe this in such a way that we actually can get to a workable answer, given resource constraints and given the current climate. I also found it extremely worrying, and this is, I mean, there are established reasons in psychology for this, is that most planners looked outward. Very few planners were willing to look inward and say, these are the issues with our profession. They were willing to say, you know, very much the view was, if we had control over everything, everything would work. And, you know, if you look at the parts the planners do have control over and how they have changed or not changed, that's a really questionable assumption as to whether that's to go forward. So just again, bearing in mind time, kind of a paper argued for three aspects. The first aspect is recognizing that we do have limited power. So if we can't always achieve big successes, then we need to start recognizing those areas that we can have small successes. So for example, when someone proposes a mega project, it's unlikely that we're going to get governments to reject that mega project. And we can kind of cry about it, if I could put it that way, or we can basically say, right, even if we can't stop this project that we know is problematic, what can we do to make it better? So even if it's a bad project, can we make it a better bad project as opposed to even if we can't stop it? So what are those small successes? The other question is, and a lot of planners love to kind of go on about capacity. There's a flip side to it. The other side of saying capacity is saying, if we don't have enough planners to execute the system, is the problem that we don't have enough planners, or is the problem that the system requires more resources than is available? So it's a look at the existing kind of plans and regulations and start to say, how do we make lean regulations that work with existing resources, but as importantly, that focus the energy of regulation on issues that actually matter. Speak to most land use planners in South Africa, and they will be able to regale you with many stories of wealthy neighbors arguing with each other, arguing over the placement of a window on a wall, and how they ended up taking days of their time. It's figuring out how do we change our system such that those issues kind of get put to the side, and important things like inclusionary retail, inclusionary housing actually brought to the fore. Kind of this third point I'm going to end with, just on the next slide, is it's also an argument that we need to look beyond conventional planning tools and embrace different approaches. So I'm going to end with this quote, and this is very much almost a bit of a critique of the previous work and kind of pushing forward. This is probably my favorite quote from the SAPER project. I'm not going to read the full part, but just reading the middle part. They were arguing as for planning as a technical and planning as art of persuasion. This person argues, because if you have a technical expert but you have no social skills, you're not going to get anything on the ground. If you're socially very fluent but you can't get a good technical plan, you're not going to get things on the ground, but they're going to be lousy. And for me, this is kind of the point I've kind of reached and starting to say is moving forward is recognizing that there's kind of two streams of planning. There's one, the technical part of planning, understanding what is good urbanism within a particular locality, and what is a good plan, so forth, so forth. But equally, and I think this is very much this question about social skills, it's more than just social skills. It's actually saying, as planners, we have power, but we don't have power over the whole process. If that is the case, then we need to sell our ideas to those who do have power. So that planning as the art of persuasion, kind of drawing on Throckmorton's ideas, etc. I would argue that that's probably the biggest area which practice and education lack. A planning graduate doesn't graduate with the ability to persuade an engineer, a counselor, a developer that their ideas are necessarily viable and better than what's been put forward. So for me, this aspect of planning as the art of persuasion is really the big challenge, both for practice and education. And it's something I can say is the challenge. I have very little clue as to how we actually answer it, other than saying we probably need to speak to people in the marketing departments as well. So kind of moving forward with the previous work, this is kind of where I'm going to, and almost arguably that the previous set of slides are possibly too meek. And it's kind of this more bold aspect that needs to kind of come forward in terms of moving forward. Okay, so last point, this is where we are, noting that with the transcripts, we've got about 700,000 words of interview data. So I think the other challenge for us is saying is we've got a lot of this work and we have limited hands. So the question is, how do we really make the most use of the data that we have? Even just reading 700,000 words is a lot of work. So how do we take it forward? Okay, I hope that was valuable. Osona, I think, do you want me to hand over to you, and then Martin after you, and then we open for discussion after that?
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thanks. I'll just share that. Okay, it says I can't share my screen while somebody else is sharing. No.
I see your screen.
Cool. Okay. So just maybe a few reflections and lessons, and I'll attempt to not duplicate what Stuart and Werner has been talking about. But I think maybe in general, I think what worked, and it's a reflection, I think, for everybody involved, is the initiative, the actually the standing of the project, the size of the sample, the support of the international partners. I think that, and I think that's, I want to say what works on the South African side. Um, because SAPER is not like any other research project that's been done in South Africa. And I think that is what I want to highlight. The way that the project has been run, the engagements, I think Lauren reflected on some of the politics here in South Africa. But I think the effort that's been made to be inclusive, to actually involve the different planning departments. So I want to say that in my mind has been one of the lessons that I've learned in reflection on it, that it was not just the academic outputs, it's the way in which the project has been done, the leadership, the dedication of the teams, and then of course the research, the process, and Lorena, what you've been talking about. I think there's incredible amount of value in the research process and the outputs. And then I think the impact focus. So this is sort of in general, I think, the reflection. One of the big things I think on in the South African side is that this SAPER project and the research that's been generated through it, the way that it's been done actually supported us to raise awareness and to do motivation in the South African context. And I think Martin will speak about it. So a lot of the things that everybody has been raising are things that obviously we don't want to just leave there. So the way that the project was structured actually enabled us to have a host of different engagements. We've been able to develop policy briefs. We've been able to have discussions. I think the fact that, for example, some of the UK team members have been here in South Africa, the multiplicity of conferences, of engagements with local government association, with SAPLAN, with government about the findings of the project. So I think those are the kind of things that systematically starts to build a different discourse in South Africa. And I think so I want to mention that, I think, as from the sort of the impact side. So it's often, I think, a challenge to say this is exactly what the project enabled. But definitely, I think it started and it enabled a discourse about planning education, a discourse about the role or the plight of young planners, about mentoring. And I think also, Martin, from your side and Vena's side, I think the collaboration between SACPlan and the South African sort of planning council together with the project, I think also added a lot of value. Because I think in that way, there was a lot of institutional almost momentum behind actually raising the debates around taking the discourses forward locally as well. And I think that was really a valuable lesson, so in my mind, of how to make sure that this project actually had impact. So sort of that's sort of, I think, in general, my reflection about what would be the value, I would say, in the South African context for SAPER. Then, of course, there are incredibly valuable research outputs. I thought initially that maybe it wasn't necessarily always new things, but a lot of the things that's been raised by SAPER are things that's been sort of, let's say, almost street knowledge or practice experience. So people would always talk about it, but nobody would have the evidence of that. And I think what SAPER did is actually gave the evidence for what people would generally speak about or what the hunch would be. So everybody would speak about the challenge of municipal capacity or the lack of mentors for planners, young planners in South Africa. But what the SAPER project did, actually at scale, enabled the illustrating the extent of that. So it actually brought the evidence for a lot of the things that have been said, I think, in planning practice and in planning education. And I think in that sense, there's a lot of value for, I think, which might not necessarily be recognized for also supporting arguments and discourses in South Africa and supporting, I think, South African practitioners to make a case and planning education and obviously SACPlan to make a case for changing practices and also actually funding, how to think differently about how to fund, for example, different programs. Then I think one of the other things that I thought was really useful is that because of the funding, and I think one shouldn't underestimate that, it enabled us to actually have conversations, like the conversation that Stuart was actually sharing, other conversations with planners. It enabled people that are passionate about planning education, but also passionate about planning practice and capacity development in planning practice to actually get together. It enabled us obviously to learn from each other, but also I think it really galvanized that kind of action, which I think the reality is in a context like South Africa, there's often not funding for those kind of things, for the travel, for hosting sessions or seminars. And I think as simple as that, this initiative actually also enabled a lot of those conversations. Then I thought quickly, 3 critical issues that I thought that came out of the project that's got a huge potential to impact planning practice and education in South Africa. I think the one is the challenges of the inappropriate systems in planning practice, and I think that's not just obviously in South Africa, but and we've spoken about it. It's what Werner shared, it's what Stuart shared, and I think it's partly also for what you were sharing. I think there's a lot of work being done currently about the credibility of the informal systems, and I think it ranges right from even the way of accessing land and getting tenure. But that issue is a huge issue, and I think it's one of the things that I think has been raised by this work and that I think need to be taken forward. The second one is the plight of young planners. I think if nothing else, I think Mishka's PhD, Martin's work, the need for mentoring, I'm not going to go into that. I think Martin will speak more about that. But it really highlights the issues of supervision, of challenges, of the contextual challenges in which planners in South Africa, I think, experience themselves in. Then I think the third one was the one about the alternative voices. And I think Lauren spoke about that as well, but about sort of difference and diversity. So I think what I found really fascinating is I had some postgraduate students this year, and because of COVID-19, all their research got cancelled. So Lauren and Stuart actually said, yes, I can use the SAPER data. So maybe Lorena, I just want to say, I've been amazed once again about the quality of those, of the sense making that you did and the codes and all of that. But what was fascinating on my side is there were 5 students and just 2 of the examples. So they actually looked at the codes and they came out of, so that their interpretation of the questions and of the findings have been, I think, in my mind, quite interesting. You were saying now, so what's the value of that data? If different people look at it, they actually see different things. So Sia, for example, actually what he did is he did a whole a narrative of his own experience as a planner. So he's a postgraduate student, but he did a narrative of his experience, of his capacity, of issues that he's sort of been reflecting on, how his background, specifically interesting identity, culture issues that he thought was actually a negative, how that actually enabled him to do things that other planners couldn't do. And then he juxtaposed that with what was said, the quotes that came out of the SAPER data. And he actually sort of played around with sort of, these are my experiences and this is what I found from the SAPER data. And that I thought it's sort of interesting views in thinking differently about what actually come out of this. Basitsana, for example, she's very passionate about the plight of Black female planners. And just the way that she engaged with it, she actually took all the interviews with the Black female planners and what she took out of that, and also juxtaposed, I think there was one interview also with a white male and a Black female, a young woman in one interview. It's really interesting. And I think because these young people come with different lenses, different interpretations. But one of the things that I thought it also raised is they are not interested in in academic publication. They're not interested in writing articles. They would be interested and keen in doing maybe blog posts or in doing podcasts, things like that. And I was thinking, I think we need to think about how do we give a voice to the people that we actually, so I can't give that voice, but somebody else can give that voice. And how do we actually encourage that? And how do we create opportunities for those voices to be heard? And maybe also through looking at this data. And also, obviously, they're very critical about the kinds of questions that were asked and what they would have done different. And I think there is a lot of opportunity for learning as well. But without it, it wouldn't have been possible. Then I thought, so very briefly, 3 issues that I think should or could have huge potential for academic outputs and for our impact. I think the one thing that consistently, and I think the team will know that I've been harping on this, is I think the importance of moving beyond the young planners lens. So we have all these interviews, we look at it and we say, what does it mean for young planners? What does it mean for planning education? But actually, we have a host of findings that says something about what does it mean for the not so young planners. I mean, we started that the conference that Stuart was talking about for young planners, and what it came out with is this survival guide for people in planning practice. In that few months before that conference, there were 3 planners in South Africa that committed suicide. People are under incredible pressure. It's a discipline where I think we all know, you find yourself and you're constantly fighting something that's almost impossible. It's doing things that you know that you won't even see the results. And in a situation where everything is about the KRAs and the KPIs and you have to tick off what you've done, I think the pressure that people are under, the pressure in terms of ethics, on a lot of those things are immense. Um, and I think we actually, there's a need for people to be supported. I mean, I now work in a project where we do capacity development in 9 municipalities, in mining municipalities across South Africa. And what the first thing is staff morale. Is just the guts to get up every day, to come to work in dire circumstances where nothing is working, where the systems is not working, where there isn't money, and to think about what is possible, and to be, I mean, in most cases, one planner that actually runs 3 departments, or a planner that's got 5 or 6 interns from MISA that's supposed to help her doing a job, and she's supposed to give them mentoring. So how do you cope in those kind of circumstances? And then I think there are major implications for planning practice, and not just for planning education. So I really think what came out of the interviews, there are a lot. Stuart was talking about resilience, adaptation, and what can be done. Then the second thing that I think came out, that I think we haven't harnessed yet, is moving beyond this sort of individual view on capacity. A lot of what we do are always about planning education. How do we create this sort of perfect, ideal planner? But I think what we see is, and we all know it, that planning isn't the one-person show. How do we think about distributed capacity? How do we think about the implications for communities of practice, for teams? If I think about the work we're now doing, mentoring is a big thing, but mentoring of teams, of building capacity, of institutional memory, of creating space for community of practice, for peer learning, for huddles, all these alternative ways of actually looking at how do we support practice, and different ways of realizing that every person doesn't need to be able to everything. And it sounds so stupid, but if you think about it, all our criteria, planning, education, all of it, it's about being able to work in teams, but we don't do much about what's the success factor. And how does working in a team actually bring that about? Okay, and then the third one, I think, is this sort of, I think Stuart also talked about it now, is that sort of just bridging the gap in terms of the focus. So I thought the SAPER focus that we've had now in this round really highlights the challenges. People were mentioning the challenges, that a lot of those interviews are about the dynamics. And I think what would really be fascinating is actually the research on the other side about the innovations in the responses. What are we doing? What can be done? What is possible? So Phil and Martin, if I think about that innovative, the tool, the platform. So those, I think, are the types of things about how do we experiment, And now that we've sort of been, we've started mid-COVID, and then sort of we thought we post-COVID, and now we're sort of back into mid-COVID again. I mean, we've been working with these municipalities on online platforms, which we all said in February it's impossible. We've seen a tremendous shift in the way that public participation is happening, in the sort of moving away from everybody needs to be in a room to make a decision, to a different culture, different engagement with things. So I think there's different opportunities now to start thinking about what are possible initiatives. A lot of the capacity development initiatives in South Africa, I think, are incredibly, they're almost stuck. So you don't have a chance to experiment. It's all about creating the ideal government, the ideal local government, about learning the ideal in terms of guidelines. So it's very rigid. What I found fascinating is this project we're doing with Anglo American, is they prepared to take chances, to actually experiment. And not experiment in terms of what they do on the ground, experiment in terms of what are best practices to actually support municipalities to develop the capacity, and planning departments and units, and multiplicity of ways. And I think that would be, in my mind, I think some of the things that would really be fascinating to also start learning between different countries, not just about the planning education side, but also the in-practice support. And I'm very glad that Stuart also introduced the sort of gap work around the mentoring, but the platforms, the way in which we can actually support these networks. So I think that in my mind would be, I think, incredibly valuable moving forward. And then just lastly, I think obviously from a personal side, I mean, personally, lots of value, lots of learning. I just actually got into the project after I've done my PhD on adult learning, and I've fallen into the National Spatial Development Framework and never actually got a chance to play around and publish. And so I really appreciated the project, and I think new perspectives, and also finding the inspiration and ways to continue the journey. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alsona. It's brilliant. Stuart?
Cool, thanks. Martin, I did, just was noting the time. I just want to see, should we just give Martin a chance to speak and then we take it from there?
Yeah, I think we should do this. I mean, I'm conscious, I mean, we kind of tried in a way to run a day event in 3 hours. So I think, I mean, as long as everybody is essentially just happy to carry on discussing, I'm fine if we just go over time. I can understand that some of you need to go, but yeah, let us know. I think in a way, I mean, for my portfolio, if it's fine with you, Stuart, I'm quite keen to keep the momentum and just to push a bit over the time.
Yeah, sure. If everyone's okay with that, I'm happy with it, yeah.
Martin?
Okay, thank you very, yes, thank you very much. I just want to check my screen is visible. Thank you.
Yes.
I want to start before I start with the presentation itself, and it's not a long presentation, is just to give a bit of context as well, where SAPER, the SAPER project came into what we were busy with. So we were working on the competency and standards project and a process, and the SAPER project came in at the back end of the project and sort of the front end mid the implementation of it. So it came at a very opportune time period where we were working on the competency and standards projects. So some of the things that we developed from there were a guideline for curriculum development. We did registration guidelines, accreditation criteria, continuous professional development. And as I say, the SAPER project, because of its timing, also affirmed what we introduced by that time, but it also affirmed a lot of what we have been planning up to that point. And Alsona also made the point of it provide evidence to certain things that we were looking at. So what we also started to do, or what happened then also during that time, is that the university started to amend and align their curriculum to the guidelines that we provided. And we also started with our new round of accreditation visits to the different institutions. I think it was also Stuart that mentioned that, and at Elsona. So one of the things that obviously that we also put in place was looking at how do we get from a colonial past with all the things that were incorporated into planning education, and how do we change that to work within a new system and a new environment. And we've also, as part of that process, we said, how do we make sure that we bring that theory practice link, the academic practice link in the universities, and we've what we coin experiential learning applied to specifically see how do universities then make sure that there is that practical training brought into the education part as well. So in my presentation, I want to touch on basically 4 aspects, and you will see how what we've started to do also link into some of the outcomes of the SAPER project, and also addressing some of the issues there. So the 4 aspects that I want to talk to is firstly the registration process, the post-registration process. I'm going to touch on work identification, and then the SAPER impact of some of the outcomes that came from the SAPER project, and how that was useful, and we are still actually using some of that as well. So with regard to the registration process, I think the first one there relates to the registration of candidate planners. That's the entry-level candidacy after you've been a student, is to streamline that further so that when a person registers or when they apply, that they can get into the system as quickly as possible. So the second one there was to strengthen the registration process, and that is to register as either professional planners or technical planners. Now, professional planners would be typically equivalent to chartered planners in the UK. So the one thing that we are currently busy with is a benchmarking against other professional bodies within the built environment, specifically with regard to outcomes and the way that we look at the experience that we're getting from the candidates. We've also looked at our practical training requirements to align that to our registration guidelines, and also to better the breadth of experience, so that when a person then registers, that we know that they can actually work independently and they can do the work that they are trained for and that they got the experience from. So looking at the post-registration process, and I think that is something that came out as well, and it was mentioned more than once, is the importance of supervision, mentoring, and things like that. And so the one thing that came out in the rules, or that was developed in 2013, is the candidate planner and supervisor link. So we've put in place put in place a system where candidate planners must then submit the names of their supervisors for approval before, and so that we know that the supervisor is in good standing, the supervisor has got the required experience to be able to do the mentoring and the supervision. So there's an application form and things like that. But then we've also introduced a professional development plan, or a personal development plan, where between the supervisor and the candidate, that they sit together and they develop their professional development goals, so that planner, when they come out of university, they know, or they say that they know virtually nothing when they come into practice, but that they, with the supervisor, can sit down and say, okay, how do I want to grow? Where do I want to be within 3 months, within 6 months, within 12 months, and so forth, and that they can then work towards that. So they've also need to identify what items there are, what are the specific actions that they're going to take, what are the performance indicators, what have they achieved, what do they want to achieve. So they need to set out the specific goals toward professional registration, but also what support do they need from the supervisor, what support do they need from the mentor. So that is then submitted to us on a 6-monthly basis, and that is then information that we will then be able to use to see where can we as SACPlan then can come in and provide additional support, set out continuous professional development courses, address some of the aspects that comes out of that. So that is what we are hoping to get from this. It was only implemented earlier this last year, but the professional development plan was only implemented end of last year, beginning of this year. And that is something that we will then be able to utilize further. And based on the experience and the outcomes from the SAPER project, it's something that we would be able to attend to further. Practical training requirements is also listed there, and I'm not going to touch on that further. The next aspect that came out was specifically with regard to the work identification, which is within South Africa really a sticky issue, and Stuart has also mentioned about a petition that was drafted. It was never submitted, but it was something that was drafted. So the background to that is when we originally published, or when the department originally published regulations with regard to work identification, it came out that there was a need to make sure that we know what are the competencies for planners. What are those core competencies that makes a planner different from another professional? And that is what we started then. The regulations was developed by the department. They never finalized that. Council then identified that as one of our priorities, and we rewritten the regulations into a set of rules. We had a pre-consultation with our voluntary associations, and we currently engaging the minister with regard to further consultation as in terms of our legislation. So that is where we are, and as we are now at the end of December, I would assume that we would be able to roll that consultation out from early next year. So looking now specifically at the SAPER impact, and I think these are just the ones that I would like to highlight that really had an impact. I think the first one there is the briefing note on bridging the gap in the candidacy phase. I think that was a very, very important briefing note that provided us with the opportunity to share that with our partners, with the department, with the South African Local Government Association, as to how do we address that. And I think that also paves the way for the supervisor candidacy process and further research that would be coming out there. I think the next one there is matching the need of planners in local government, also a briefing note that we've been using. And it's one of the things that those two briefing notes we've specifically used with our discussions with SALGA to see how do we ensure that municipalities get the correct capacity in their different departments. We find that there's municipalities that do have planning departments, but there are no planners, or there are no qualified planners. And how do we rectify that to make sure that planning actually happens? Another, I think, a very important part of that was one of the first outcomes related to the registration data. We've used it in our newsletter. It was used at the transformation in Durban, and I think the feedback that I've received so far was very, very positive with regard to what was achieved. It is things that you could see, it's things that you know, but we did not have the evidence, and as Alsana said, evidence were provided here. I've mentioned about the department where we've used these type of information with them, as well as SALGA. Lorena, that is my very short presentation. Yeah, and I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Werner, I'm just wondering, because you're about to leave, is there anything you want to say? And then then Stuart can take back over for the discussion.
I think the only thing is really just to I think there's a lot of opportunity between SACPLAN and the UCAP and possibly the RTPI that I've mentioned in the notes. And I'm seeing Stuart tomorrow, so I'll catch up with him then about the rest of the discussions. I'm sorry I can't continue, but I'm an hour late for the other meeting already.
Thank you very much, Rhoda. I'm just conscious we're just running completely over time. Thank you again.
Right. Bye.
Cheers. See you soon. Stuart, shall I just hand it to you?
Sure. So I think we can open up for discussion. If I could ask Paul to actually kickstart it. Paul, just noticed me these quite interesting comments. So Paul, if you here still?
No, Paul had to leave.
Oh, Paul. Okay.
Yes. So we had a question from Cliff and from Clive, who made also some points. So maybe we can start here. Paul, yes, and his apologies. He was running late to another meeting as well. And Lorena needs to leave in a little bit as well.
Cool. Then maybe Clive, do you want to come in?
Yeah, okay, thanks very much. Sorry if it might sound a little bit sort of simplistic, but as a sort of non-academic and a long time since I've had any direct involvement other than through this this study, but in terms of all of the things that have been identified through the project and the influence that is being sought on students, I think it was in your I think it was in Stuart's presentation. I think it was right at the very end where you were saying that, well, when a student enters a profession, enters work, they're starting at a very junior level and really not able to make any sort of significant changes to the infrastructure with which they're working. So there's a basic problem, as I see it, where it's a kind of seeking, it's almost like a generational change. If we're trying to change and improve planning education and make students more aware of some of the issues that we've been talking about, there's going to be a generation before those, or quite a long time before those students actually get into positions of influence to undertake the powers of persuasion that planners have. And my comment in my note was recognizing the important value of the planning professions, such as the RTPI and others, and organisations such as CAP, who can promote planning at a more, perhaps a more sort of wider, across a wider sort of spectrum through various different means, and also using that to kind of seek change or impress on local governments and central government. So I really see a clear role for the planning professions in picking up some of the thinking that is being developed through the planning education process. And also, just my final point on this really is a clear role for CPD programs for people who are sort of wherever they are in their planning sort of careers, to have sort of CPD programs that kind of reflect the kind of planning education that we've been talking about sort of through this research. Thank you.
Thanks, Clive. Okay, just opening up the floor.
Do you want to respond, Stuart, or should we just hand it over to Cliff?
I think let's hand it over to Cliff. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I can't particularly remember what the point was that I made now. I've been trying to scroll through and find it, but anyway. But I think number one, it's been a really stimulating session, and thanks so much. And I think many congratulations to everybody who's been involved. It's unfortunately not everybody's able to hear that, but I do sincerely congratulate everybody. I think it's a very impressive project and clearly been well led and very inclusive and as I say, stimulates lots of ideas. So I'll try and be quick. Really picking up what seems to me a really fundamental point from Stuart about essentially, if I'm putting words in your mouth, Stuart, being a bit more pragmatic and focusing on what's possible and what's doable, and that the role of planning education should be to give people the skills to make a difference within a defined framework of what can be done, which echoes some of what Clive's just been saying as well. And I think I've got some difficulties with that. And it perhaps goes back to a point somebody else made earlier about the kind of drift away from the post-colonial focus. I think my difficulty is that the essence of planning a city, a settlement, is that without that planned action, you'd have some kind of suboptimal outcome. And we could decode what that means in different ways, whether it's in terms of design quality or climate change or economic inequality or whatever it is. But there's clearly a kind of starting presumption that planning can make a difference for good. And that's clearly also a contested concept. And the space in which planning operates in the end is some kind of negotiated outcome, partly path dependent, which is very clear in South Africa. And it's also clear that planners are not the only party who can determine that space. But if the more we define the role of the university as being to prepare people to feel comfortable in that space, then it seems to me the more marginal the impact that planning is likely to achieve. And I always think that there has to be a counterpoint from the university. You know, I mean, I've said many times that there seems to me the role of the university isn't to prepare people for practice, but to be ahead of practice, to lead practice, to challenge. And I just feel that we mustn't lose that dimension. I recognize entirely that there's an ethical issue here. Are you misleading people? Are you providing, you know, kind of false hopes? But it's also notable when you know, people were saying that the main influence you actually learn when you get that year or two in the job. That's where you pick up things. There's clearly, again, the possibility that is going to replicate the pragmatic, the doable, the constrained, and sift out any wider thought. So you can argue that, you know, the bit that the university has is the chance to provide some alternative framework for what will be a socializing process once people are in the job. So finally, I just wonder, one thought that went through my head listening to all this is the whole thing about innovation, you know, which we know has been a huge thing in the wider literature, economics, business literature, and so on, and even social innovation literature. And you know, one empirical question is, where has innovation come from over the last 20, 25 years in planning? Has it come from universities and university research? Has it come from practice? Has it come from government? Has it come from actions from communities? Or has it come again from outside forces, whether, you know, the development industry or whatever? And I don't know the answer to that, but it seems to me a question we really ought to ask, because, you know, one key role again of the academia in respect to its service to the profession, which is largely overlooked, I think, and therefore marginalized, undervalued, is that it should be a source of new ideas, of new ways of doing things, of new products even. And I wonder whether it's actually done that, and if not, why not? And if not, how could it do that? So that's enough to make you respond, Stuart.
Sure. Okay, Lauren, I think I was going to respond to both Clive and Cliff's point, if that's okay.
Yep, and then, I mean, Olafia, it would be great if we can pass it over to her, and she can also mention what CAP is doing for the mentorship scheme. Okay,
definitely, sounds good. Yeah, Cliff, I don't think we actually disagree as much with the different points, you know, especially your point about saying, you know, we need to produce graduates who are ready for ahead of practice. And I think, Clive, also your point, I think, really speaks to this as well. You know, young planners have little power, as you said, and it takes time to see the impact. I think what we need to recognize, and I think Mark Aranya's work with Tassin, I forget his surname, Turkish scholar, where they did the Young Planners book. You know, when I looked at young planners, and so I think you're involved with that work as well. When I looked at like young planners work around the globe, there was this kind of strong sense of frustration. Now, frustration is a good thing, and it can be a bad thing depending on how it's employed. You know, frustration can help lead us to kind of effecting change, but frustration that can't be resolved can also just result in disillusionment. So, you know, for me, I agree almost 100% with what you're saying about planners need to be ready to be ahead of practice. But what we need to be doing is kind of equipping planners, saying, you know, when you enter into the workplace, you are potentially in your first few years only going to be able to have limited impact, but giving them the ideas about how to actually be able to have that impact in the younger years. And I remember one of our transcripts, one of the planners from City of Cape Town, one of the senior guys, a guy I've got a lot of respect for, that he actually mentioned this thing about young planners coming in and pushing for these new ideas. And a lot of those ideas that they're pushing for don't come around, as you say, for years to come. But, you know, from Jaco's perspective, there was this very clear perspective of, you know, these young planners are bringing stuff and we actually are seeing it, even if it takes time. But it's, I think we really do agree, you know, it is training planners to be ahead of practice. But what I'm seeing, what I saw as a practitioner and what I'm still seeing as an academic is planners, even older planners, are really struggling to make this link between these planning theories and what they're seeing on the ground. And I think for that for us is the challenge. It's to say, you know, what planning practice should be, even if what it's not, but we've got to make it clear. And I think for me that really is the challenge. There is an issue with what you learn in practice, because often we have this comment saying, you know, we teach stuff at university and then people learn practical skills when they go into practice. The problem is there is no control over that process. So you might be lucky and end up in a municipality or a business or an organization that properly does train the young planners, that gives them the proper skills that they actually need, or you might not. You know, it's a very much of a flip of the coin in terms of what industry you end up in, what skills you learn, and how well you learn them. So I think for me, it's also the other part of the, and I think that's partly where this candidacy discussions have been quite important. It's saying, okay, if universities teach one set of skills and practice teaches another set of skills, and that's what it takes to become a fully fledged planner, how do we ensure that that process actually does result in a fully fledged planner? You know, right now it's very much of a flip of the coin depending on who you work for. And I think that itself is highly problematic. And I think, Clive, what you're talking about, recognizing the importance of organizations in promoting planning, I think, you know, this conversation with Martin and SACPlan about this candidacy phase is partly why this has become so important. It's saying, you know, what do we really want people to learn in those first 2 years? Cool. So hopefully that was a clear enough answer with everything. But yeah.
Can I just reply quickly? A couple of things. I mean, that suggests that maybe SACPlan should accredit employers and not individual planners.
Potentially.
I mean, one thing nobody's actually discussed is, you know, we've assumed that, and it may be, in my experience, it probably is, pretty much has been the South African pattern, that students are students and practitioners are practitioners. But, you know, in the courses, the programs I taught on, we had a sandwich year in practice, so on the undergraduate. So the undergraduates for the last 2 years in the program had a year in practice, and that was really crucial. We taught planning theory in year 3. After they came back in, year 4 there was a 2-1-2 sandwich. And similarly, the postgrads, a lot of them were part-timers working, in some cases with many years experience, working in practice. So you actually had them in the seminar group with your full-time postgrads who were usually, you know, straight from university. So you actually had, you know, a lot of different dimensions to play around with. It wasn't just that there was a monoculture of education and a monoculture of practice. Sorry, I've said too much, and I'll hand over to others.
I got the cat at the same time.
Oliver?
Yeah, thank you. Apologies for that. I had to quickly join to another meeting, and my Wi-Fi wasn't that stable during the previous one. Thank you. I apologize. I missed a lot of the conversation, I'm sure, around that is relevant to the young planners. But so far, well done on the work. Well done on the success of the project. and it's really beneficial. I think I'm not sure if it was Pat or someone mentioned it. I don't want to get the person's name wrong, about the fact that this is very good in terms of it provides the evidence to confirm what we have on ground. And from a young planners perspective, yes, with Commonwealth Association of Planners, the Young Planners Network, we've carried out some surveys. We've been asking questions around from the young planners, and a lot of what was identified as part of the challenges are actually what the young people, the young planners are facing. And really, another approach that we've been working on is looking at how we can combine different knowledge together from different sectors, and looking at how that can help to improve knowledge and probably improve capacity as well, and also improve the morale, because in a lot of the global south young planners that we have, the morale is really low in terms of planning. And in terms of innovation, a lot of the young planners they're not moving towards digital technology innovation, and they're moving outside of the planning to urban innovation or to agri-tech, technology, which would have been very useful for it if they were in planning, because the same innovations that we've been seeing would have been relevant as well in the cities. And what we have done from our side is we have introduced a mentoring program. Incidentally, we have the highest potential mentees from South Africa as of now. That's quite interesting. And so it really shows that the young planners really want mentors. They want to know what the future is for them in terms of their career if they're following the traditional planning routes. And they also want to know what the future looks like for them outside of the traditional planning route. And that's why we have a mentoring program to be that sounding board, for mentors to be the sounding board, and also be able to hold the young planners as they progress in their career. The program is for 12 months. And we're looking forward to it being an annual program where we can pair a mentee with a mentor, and the mentor must have had at least 10 years professional experience in planning. One of the things we found out also is that we had a lot of planning students as well, who are also interested in having professional mentors, so that they can easily move from their education straight into to a planning role without having to wait, because at the same time, unemployment is a big issue for the planners when they leave, in terms of in the global south as well. So that's why we have our program, and we look forward to using the data and the support that we'll be getting from this from the SAPER project. Really, it's been very good and useful for us. We've been thinking about other projects. We're thinking of a CPD program that young planners can listen to, that would be from practitioners, as well as CPD programs that would be from academians as well. So that there is that blend, and there is the opportunity to interpret theories in practice at the same time. That's what we're looking at. And also to encourage real-time community projects on ground. So those are some of the projects that we're looking at, and that really the SAPER project, the outcome, and this old data would really support our evidence going forward. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Cool. I just want to check. I think we're moving towards kind of last words. I just want to do a quick round things. Osona, I know you've been quite involved on the mentoring side. I don't know if you want to quickly say a response, if you want, or if you don't want to, it's absolutely fine too.
Yeah, maybe just I think one of the things that we're now seeing in practice is we've got a challenge for mentors and mentees matching. So we've been working with the National Business Institute, because they've got a psychometric test where they actually test psychometric testing, which people are actually matchable. Because if you match people without them knowing each other across geographies, I think so. So I think there's lots of interesting learning and work that's been done about what the criteria are and what are possibilities to create success. But I think there's another aspect as well that we're picking up in practice is that the idea of mentoring is very good, but people are under incredible pressure. So what we do see is if the mentoring is not linked to an outcome like SAC plan registration, or in some cases to a project or to support, then because of the lack of capacity in the municipalities, actually the mentoring program falls by the wayside. So there are all kinds of almost like carrots and sticks that's now being introduced to make sure that the mentoring actually happens and that time is created for it and that it can happen. Yeah. So I think there's interesting learning that would be useful. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, also. Martin, I just want to check. Do you want to say anything on this?
Stuart, I've said something in the chat box. So no, I don't have anything else to add at this moment in time.
Okay, definitely.
Clive, I think you asked to say.
Hand
up.
Yeah, just quickly, I'm just conscious that everyone wants to sort of go off, but I think if you want to make changes in planning practice, then clearly, what's been discussed and talked through in this project has been fantastic. But it's still going to be within a regulatory legislative framework that itself needs to change. And if one wants to change that framework, then who are the policymakers at a sort of in government? Because that's where some of this work needs to be targeted and some of the people need to be sort of influenced and persuaded. And I just sort of reiterate the point I made earlier that I feel that academia has a key role in that, but also the professions. And I think that linkage between the professions, the professional bodies, campaigning for effective planning, supported by academia, I think that is just one way one can start to get the kind of changes. Because unless we do change the regulatory legislative frameworks in ways that can accommodate the kind of world that we want in the future, then we're going to move forward very slowly.
Yeah, very true. Stuart, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah. Just trying to think what to wrap up with, etc. Because I think this has been quite a good summary with that. Yeah, I think actually nothing more from my side. I think again, just thank you to everyone who's attended. I think this engagement's really been useful. I think both for kind of wrapping up the project, but also kind of getting an idea about looking forward. If we do another work, what are the areas that we actually need to pick up on? What are the aspects that kind of come forward? Yeah, so from my side, just a thank you to everyone, both for attending, but also for your contributions, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I share totally the view. And I mean, it's just a small committee. There's probably no point just to wrap up everything. What we will do is we'll probably sort of do a general email to everyone just to, I mean, reinforce, I mean, the thank you, but also the fact that all this will be made available on the SAPER website. So people will be able to listen to it anyway. And I mean, there's still one big report on the ESRC side that will need to be produced. So we'll be circulating this probably at a later stage because I still haven't been asked to produce it. So it's still on my list, but not for now.
Cool.
So thank you, everyone. I mean, we've run the event in a very French way, in the sense that we didn't bother about time. But at least, I mean, I'm glad we spent time and we used the right time to discuss everything. So thanks again, and we'll be in touch and we'll see you soon, and have a lovely Christmas.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thing that got you.
Thank you. We're talking tomorrow, Stuart.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so see you tomorrow.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Alsana. Bye-bye. Bye, Martin. Bye, Cliff.
Lawrence, one thing before you close the recording, I'm not sure if the chat always records, so I'm just struggling to kind of download it on my side. We might need to just save the chat separately.
I'm just going, let me just pause. Okay, I'm just going to stop the recording.